I'm Dr. Scott Masson with my colleague Dr. Bill Friesen for Paideia today, and we are going to indulge ourselves a little bit by spending a second episode on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Last time we just set the stage really for our portrait because of the various themes that were involved in it. But today we're going to go through the text in some detail at any rate, and I'm going to pass it over at this point to my colleague Bill. Go ahead.
Thank you, Scott. I'm reading the little bit that starts at line 130 here in the first fit, where we see the entry, the rather spectacular entry of the Green Knight into the feasting hall of King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table. And I'll see how well I can do this here with my old eyes. Now I will say nothing more about how they were served, for everyone can guess that no shortage was there. Another noise, quite different, quickly drew near, so that the king might have leave to swallow some food, for hardly had the music stopped for a moment, and the first course been properly served to the court, when there burst in at the hall door a terrible figure, in his stature the very tallest on earth, from the waist to the neck so thick-set and square, and his loins and his limbs so massive and long. In truth, half a giant I believe he was. But anyway, of all men I judge him the largest, and the most attractive of his size who could sit on a horse. For while in back and chest his body was forbidding, both his belly and his waist were becomingly trim, and every part of his body equally elegant in shape. His hue astounded them, set in his looks so keen, for boldly he rode in. And overall, so I'm going into Middle English, completely emerald green. So this is the spectacular entry of the fabulous, I should say rather marvelous Green Knight, because the concept of the marvel is absolutely central to the operations of medieval romance, and he is indeed a marvelous figure who will set in motion some marvelous deeds to come. And of course, this is as we mentioned in the previous podcast, this incident is coming at an interesting time of year. This is Christmas and moving into the new year. So it's a very significant time on the liturgical calendar of the medieval imagination. This is the time of new life, of rebirth, an engendering of hope in the celebrations that are everywhere. And the figure of the Green Knight, of course, factors into all of this very centrally.
Why is he in green? Why is he so large? Why is he so good looking?
There's a lot
that's an incongruous combination. The green and the large have monstrosity about it. The small waist and the sort of Superman torso seems like it doesn't quite fit. What do you make of this here?
There's a number of things. I mean, a lot of scholars have said a lot of things very confidently about what things connote in this story and what things symbolize in this story. I'm going to adopt a rather medieval position on this, and to say all we have are our best guesses. So that's what I'm giving you here. There are some highly suggestive guesses we can make about the color green, about his stature. They mention that he's a gigantic man, one of the most gigantic men who can be carried on horse. We've got the time of the year, all these sorts of things. So I'm just going to put these out as suggestions. Let's start with the gigantic man on horse motif. This is actually a motif that goes way back into, in this case, not Celtic lore, but Germanic lore. It says at a certain point in Beowulf that Hugelac was so huge that his feet dragged on the ground. And this is a motif you hear mentioned around several legendary Germanic figures out of ancient Germanic myth, that they were men who were either so big that horses could barely bear them, or that their feet dragged on the ground, or that horses couldn't carry them at all. But they're huge, gigantic men. That's how big they were. And this is a standard way of describing the sheer size of the individual. So it's very interesting that it crops up here. Can we draw any direct lines between those legends and what we're encountering in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight? No, we can't. All we can say is that it's highly suggestive. So there's that. The color green is overwhelmingly important in this tale, perhaps obviously Sir Gawain and the Green Knight title. And green is going to come back and haunt us in scene after scene with individuals and symbolic items and things of that nature. So again, let's begin by scratching our heads and thinking a little bit about what green traditionally has symbolized in the Western imagination. And obviously one of the things that I've already mentioned here is fertility, hope, and new life. In particular, we see decorations of holly bobs and things like this around, which are traditional sort of decorations for Christmas and New Year's and what have you. You'd find them all over the place in medieval villages and castles and keeps at this time of the year. And the holly, of course, is significant because the holly bush is significant because it keeps its green leaves even in the dead of winter. It remains green when everything else is bare and brown and gray and looks dead. So it is often seen as a sign that new life will return again. There's a notion that nature is not done with us. The season of death, which of course is winter, will not persist forever, and spring shall come again, new hope shall come again, fertility shall come again, new things shall come again in the springtime. And it has been mentioned that the holly berries, the red berries, contrast strikingly with those green leaves of the holly tree, and that perhaps this in some primitive sense represents the blood of sacrifice, which is required to return to that realm of new life and hope and these sorts of things. This conflates very suggestively and very richly with medieval notions of Christmas and perhaps modern notions of Christmas as well, wherein we celebrate the birth of Christ at this time of year. Mm-hmm. And how Christ himself for all mankind brings the hope of new life here in the midst of the season of death. And that association is made quite explicit by St. Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with St. Augustine of Hippo, who came in 597 to, at the behest of Gregory the Great, to the coasts of England to begin the conversion process of the pagan Anglo-Saxon barbarians. And he landed in, I think it was Kent, and things took off from there. But, and I might have mentioned this previously around Beowulf or somebody like this, but I'll mention it very quickly here, mm-hmm. Which is that he sent a letter back, which we still have, to Pope Gregory asking what he was to do with the pagan sanctuaries, the pagan temples.
Yes, yeah, you mentioned this, but go on.
And also, what is he to do with the pagan religious holidays?
Right.
And Gregory told him convert it. So the notion here is that it's likely that the holly bobs, holly wreaths, stuff like this, are pre-Christian symbols, which nevertheless speak to this hope for new life and the sacrifice that needs to go into the new life and the red and the green and all that rich interplay. So that gets converted to Christian imagination, Christian purposes.
Yeah.
You've got to have a very striking painting that you put up here, Scott.
Yeah, it looks like it's medieval. I'm not sure the exact origin of this, but it's got the sort of the telltale Victorian signs about it. Sorry, I said medieval, I meant Victorian. It's just the image of the figure and the ladies looking up, and so it looks like that late 19th century period, with the man not looking particularly gigantic actually, but aside from that, obviously the Green Knight, and something romantic about it as well here, and not quite so monstrous or terrifying, I think. But at least this is not what I would see in my mind's eye. He does not look infinitely larger than the other ones.
No.
So
we have to remember that our understanding of the Middle Ages, and particularly the High Middle Ages, runs through a great series of filters and lenses historically. Each era remakes the Middle Ages to some extent in its own image, and I think that painting that you showed there really kind of highlights that tendency. And if we're not careful, I think oftentimes we can come to medieval literature and the Middle Ages more generally speaking, without explicitly registering in our own minds that we're actually getting multiple interpretations of an interpretation of an interpretation of the Middle Ages, or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight specifically. We have to be careful about that, I think. This is one of the reasons I insist on, when I'm reading medieval literature, defamiliarizing myself as much as possible to see the wonderful strangeness of these tales and this worldview.
So, I mean, I say more or less what you've said there. I mean, it seems obvious that the symbolism of the holly is a symbol of an evergreen, symbol of life, so forth, to this day. Those symbols are used. The colors red and green are used as traditional Christmas colors. Uh, Martin Luther made it famous in the O Tannenbaum, the Christmas tree, as it's translated into English. So something of the ancient Yule tide festivals. Phrase is still used in English, although people don't know what it means. Seems rather antiquated. One final thing, it's remote from the text here really, but it is a contemporary gloss on these sorts of things, which is ties in with what you said about the fact that these texts would have, or the idea of a Yule festival would have predated the Christians that came here. And so some have said that the Christmas festival has been put into this date for, there was no December 25th is arbitrary, and that it was connected to this for apologetic reasons and all this sort of thing. I think there are texts that demonstrate that December 25th was pretty early on established, long before the encounter with the Britons and their Yule Tide festival, but nonetheless, there are obvious overlaps there. But one of the things that people want to do is they see Christianity as an imposition on another culture, and it's a sort of a cultural appropriation, and they want to restore the primacy of the original images and so forth. So you get this new paganism, and this might be the response to everything that you've said at this point. How do you respond to that? Because it's certainly a resurgence of paganism, and even full-blooded paganism, which includes sacrifices then as well.
Yeah, I oftentimes hear people mention how what is celebrated as Christmas nowadays is "quote unquote" inauthentic.
Right.
The phrase you use there, of course, is a loaded one used oftentimes in cancel culture, that it's cultural appropriation or something
Right.
like this. And I think, especially the initial missionaries like Augustine and what have you, who were dealing with this sort of situation, would have been rather perplexed by those protests. And they would have simply said, look, we encountered something that was important to a fallen people. And as they were converted to Christianity, so also many of their important sort of cultural icons could be converted as well to good effect. That is exactly what we encounter in that letter.
So rather than canceling their culture, we're appropriating it and giving a nod of legitimacy to it, while the full meaning of this has been hidden to the pagans, and we are revealing the full significance of it.
Correct.
Yeah.
Also remember the December 25th date. That put me in mind here that until we encountered, and again, I think I might have mentioned this glancingly at a certain point earlier on, until we get to the history of the English church and people by that famous historian, the Venerable Bede, we had been dating history in a great series of very confusing layers. We have regnal dating on the one hand. We have this other thing known as indictions, whereby you would reckon in 15-year cycles, and then you would repeat it, and then you would repeat it. And we have three different kinds of breakdowns when it comes to indictions. One, which is known as the Greek indiction. By the way, this starts in 312. They start doing this. This starts on September 1st. Then you have the imperial indiction, which starts on September 24th. And then finally, you have the pontifical indiction, which starts on December 25th. And so you would begin the new 15-year cycle. And then, of course, along comes Bede, and Bede has read this obscure historian, Dionysius Exiguus. And Dionysius said, this is all very confusing. Why don't we just date history from the birth of Christ onwards, and then everything before that is prior to that, and we'll date backwards, and it's just a lot cleaner. He was exiguous means small or insignificant or humble or something like this, and predictably he was ignored. And along comes the Venerable Bede in the dark fastnesses of northern England. And Bede says, actually, this guy had a great idea. That's how I'm going to date everything in my history of the English church and people. And because that text spread so widely as essentially the primary history text of the early Middle Ages, however Bede did historiographical business became the standard respected way of doing business. And so that's why we date things as we date.
I find this endlessly fascinating. It does give rise to the question, if not this, then what? I mean, if it's not going to be this, even if you want to do what modern historiographers do or secular scholars do, and rather than using BC and AD, the Anno Domini, and they use BCE, before the Common Era, my question always is, well, what's common about the Common Era per se? And really they lack the knowledge of what you've just said about the fact that time around this period is dated from the time of Christ, and it's established. And if we don't look at it that way, then what do we do, and what would replace that chronology? And it's unclear, and anybody's ever come up with an alternative to it.
No, and I think in addition to that, we have to remember that the people who are trying to shift things around nowadays are doing so for largely political reasons.
Yeah,
As far as to say fashionable political reasons. And whereas Bede was deciding to date as he dated things for hard, professional, efficient, pragmatic reasons, on the other hand, which seems to me a stronger set of criteria. But what do I know? I'm just a medievalist.
But I mean, almost scientific then, you would say, like it's a way of fashioning and understanding time in the ages and how, yes, that's right.
Efficiency is essential to this. And obviously, the Venerable Bede was a deeply pious individual. And to then set that start point as the historical axis around which history, the birth of Christ, as the axis around which which history orbits, seems elegant.
It's not just elegant. It's something that seems not to be eradicated. And for Christians, once again, time has a beginning and an end, and it's centered around the coming of Christ, and there'll be a second coming. So that all of these things give it a trajectory. And when one speaks of progress, which one does these days, if one dispenses with the idea of the second coming, what is one progressing towards? All of these things, these questions are begged, and there's nothing that fills it actually per se. Anyway, I could talk about this all day because I really find it interesting, and probably our listeners do as well, because they haven't heard what you just said there either. So I think that there will be some interest, but we better move on with the text here because we will end up geeking out and talking at great length about this. And we haven't even described him in any specific detail aside from his stature. What about his armament? We haven't said anything about what he is holding there. The axe and the shield and the holly. Do you have any pictures there of any sort? I don't know if you do, and if not, just describe them for us.
I have no pictures of that. I do have a later on in our discussion today. I've got by Albrecht Dürer, Death, Knight, and the Devil, and there's a couple sort of iconographic details of that that connect to our tale today, Sir Gawain and the Green.
Okay, but so let me say then he has a battle axe. And it's very described as this is not just any old axe. This is a very large type of, is it a Norse axe even?
It seems to be, and this, I mentioned this last time, there are a strangely, anomalously large number of Scandinavian, that is to say, Viking loanwords in this story. And as I said on the last podcast, they show up in very strategic points and then they vanish again, as do the French loanwords.
Yeah.
So there seems to be a steady, quiet undercurrent of certain Scandinavian sensibilities. And one of the great icons, of course, of Viking culture is the great axe. I've got one hanging up over there over my right shoulder. In point.
Of course you do.
Of course I do.
What else would you have hanging over your right shoulder besides the skull on the shelf? But never mind that. Yes.
I'm surrounded by the morbid. So.
Indeed.
Memento mori. Anyway,
yes.
Yes, he strikes a very impressive figure. He's gigantic, of course, almost supernaturally gigantic, of course, in addition to the great axe, giants.
So the axe, the shield, and the holly. No, he doesn't have a shield here, actually. He's got the axe and the holly bob. Why those two things? So one is obviously a threatening sign. Mm-hmm. The other, but he has no armament either. He has no hauberk. He has no armor.
No.
One in the other in the other. Okay, so the
So
what's
the
with that?
so the weapons. People talk a lot about the sort of ceremonial, ritualistic nature of certain weapons in the Middle Ages, and it's true that we have some extraordinary, beautiful, richly made weapons from the Middle Ages, as we do from other ages, which do not seem to have been intended for actual battle. They're simply too fine. Oftentimes, the metals used in them are selected for
Beauty.
appearance
Rather.
rather than actual fighting. Um, and here we seem to have a somewhat, again, with all things symbolic in this story, I always want to say I'm following the spirit of Occam here. We have only our best guesses, and that's all these are, but we need to guess anyway what these things symbolize. The axe is, amongst other things, not just associated with Scandinavian culture and battle and berserkers and all that kind of stuff. And the berserker figure, by the way, kind of threatens a little bit in the background here as well, but not quite. But also it's oftentimes used as a sacrificial weapon. That is to say, it's the weapon that's used to sacrifice. And there does seem something deeply ritualistic about the beheading game, which is about to happen. And scholars have spilled a lot of ink on this front. It's not my central concern, but I do note it when I teach this text to my students.
So the axe is for sacrificial purposes. The holly bob, then, as I've called it, I have often presented, and we just talked about this a little bit, that it may not. I mean, when you think of holly, and you have any contemporary associations, it's something that you hang. And like the mistletoe, perhaps, or something that adorns the tree. But and so, is he going to go kiss him here? I don't think so. There's none of that here. But nonetheless, he has it in one hand. Our attention is drawn to it. What is the connotation? I wondered whether it was a reference to Loki, this Norse god that threw a holly bob and slew the king's son with it, in light of the fact that he has this Norse axe. But I'm totally speculating, and I don't know.
But it's rich and potentially very productive speculation, because if you don't know the myth, there is a myth. It may be a relatively late myth. One of the Norse gods who doesn't get a lot of airtime in a lot of the other myths is Baldur, the beloved god. And he is invulnerable to all and every weapon, every malaise. He's effectively he's bulletproof. Which, of course, after we had discussed the gods around the Iliad and the Aeneid, of course, we would expect many modern readers to shrug and say, of course, he's a god, so of course he's immortal and invulnerable. But no, Norse gods are mortal. This is the things that makes them so fascinating. They can be harmed, they can be killed. It's just extraordinarily difficult to do so. But Baldur can only be killed by the one thing you just mentioned, holly, or rather the holly bob. And Loki, being Loki, well, there's a game going on in the Great Hall, and they're throwing various things and attacking Baldur with various things, and it's all very funny and what have you. This is the Norse gods being funny and having fun, trying to kill someone. And along comes Loki, who knows very well that the holly will kill Baldur, and he throws the shaft and it kills Baldur. And then there's a lot that comes out of that. But Baldur is, interestingly, Baldur is said to be resurrected afterwards.
Right.
He is the one god who is resurrected afterwards. Right. You're in the new age, a very strange age. But in any event, yeah.
But a sort of a Christ figure then in Norse literature, right?
Dictionaries definitely connected Baldur with the figure of Christ. So there's a rich network of associations there. Again, we have to stop short of asserting things with absolute certainty, because we just can't draw those lines professionally. But there is a lot clearly going on here, and maybe the original author simply meant these connections, the various symbolic registers of all these things, and the way that they weave together, to be elusive and suggestive rather than strict and canonical and clear.
That seems to me the best interpretation.
Yeah. So we get into this game. Let's talk a little bit about the beheading game. The beheading game is, it's a motif that goes back again, both in Germanic and Celtic myth and legend and literature. Oftentimes in Germanic strains, it is associated with riddling and the riddling game that comes along with it. And
like Gollum and the Lord of the Rings, that sort of, yeah.
definitely pointing towards this rich line of narrative. We also know that the ancient Celts, the ancient pre-Christian Celts, were strangely obsessed with severed heads. I know, it's the kind of thing you can't make up. And with ancient Celtic, you can call them palaces, though that word is enormously anachronistic. The royal houses of various Celtic war leaders oftentimes had a stone door frame, a stone lintel over the top. Mm-hmm. These are massive constructions. Some people have tried to associate them, I think, very dubiously with structures such as Stonehenge and what have you, though they're nowhere near as large. But the interesting here is that they would actually carve large niches into these stone door frames, and into these would go the skulls of individuals. We don't know for sure if they were their enemies or their ancestors or who these individuals were, but the head went in there. And so the ancient Celts mention severed heads on many different occasions and clearly had it in their iconography and in their imagination. Here we have another head being severed, of course, because that is exactly what the Green Knight suggests as the game. He comes riding into the hall, bit of a no-no that, makes a spectacular entrance, and suggests that they have a little bit of fun.
One other thing he does before he suggests that is he asks who is in charge, because he can't tell. Even though King Arthur is set in the middle on the at the centerpiece of the table, he suggests that he doesn't know who is the Lord there. So there is more than a little bit of not only alarm, but obvious insult.
Yeah, he's right at the get-go. He's suggesting that either Arthur isn't recognizable, isn't behaving in a recognizable leadership fashion, or some such. And indeed, very quickly, we see Arthur show a lack of leadership skills right at the front end. You'll recall we were discussing last podcast how in the middle and later part of the Arthurian tradition in the Middle Ages, Arthur is quite consistently, not absolutely consistently, but quite consistently shown as a bad king. Mallory in the Morte Arthur makes great hay with this. And here again, we have, this author here also is following that tradition. Arthur comes off looking rather badly. And it's Gawain who swoops in to save the day.
And just prior to that, we need to move on, but just prior to that, the reason that they are delaying at this Christmas tide is because Arthur demanded a miracle before he would eat. He refused to eat until such time as a miracle had taken place or some sort of fell deed had been performed, right? Is that not something?
He's after some form of marvel.
Yes.
And the marvel, to put it in more French terms here, is a kind of fantastic intrusion, sometimes a sustained fantastic intrusion into the narrative that we encounter in medieval romance here. Of course, in this case here, it takes the form of the Green Knight as the figure of the Green Knight, and then the things that the Green Knight brings to pass in at various removes. So this is all very marvelous stuff. Arthur may also be waiting for that in story form at the front end, but it turns out he gets the real live form, which in turn becomes a story in which he doesn't actually figure very
prominently at all.
Yeah, right. Doesn't prominently or well. So
okay, so then the beheading game ensues. And how much do we want to say about this other than that?
A little bit about this at the front. Well, first of all, let me signal one little sort of thematic thing at the beginning here. We have the iconography of the holly and the little red berries on the background of the green holly leaves. And we talked about how the green represents things traditionally like new life, new hope, fertility, all that kind of stuff. And the red berries represent blood, because blood needs to be spilled in the traditional celebrations, especially with pagan Yule, we think, in order to bring about the new life that comes out of here. And so I think in the iconography of the holly, we also see a thematic sort of nod here. The Green Knight is going to bring a process to the Knights of the Round Table and to Gawain in particular, whereby sacrifice and new life are notions which are interplaying interestingly throughout the entire text here. So we need to keep that kind of at the forefront of our minds as we read closely the text.
That's why I think the reference to Balder and his death and rebirth, as it were, are at least alluded to in the back of the reader's mind. But
so they have that kind of pushing to the forefront here.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the psychology or the psychological landscape as the Green Knight throws out his, it's not really a challenge, but it is a challenge. A lot of my students express shock and dismay that somebody would suggest such a bizarre game. And they write it off as saying, well, you know, the medieval mind was more superstitious and wasn't as critical, or all sorts of dismissive things. And I tell my students, pay close attention here. The court of King Arthur goes deadly quiet when Green Knight throws this challenge out. Why? Because they're shocked, they're stunned, they're appalled. What a weird suggestion, striking each other's heads off. And it just gets more and more awkward. You can imagine if you yourself were sitting there and the Green Knight rode in and said what he said and did what he did. You would be thinking to yourself, what is the catch? Are you insane? Okay, you don't seem to be insane. So, okay, so what's the catch? What's going on here?
The insanity is that he offers to take the first hit. That's the insanity. It's not that he wants a fight with an axe. It's that he offers to take the first blow and then to return it in a day. And the terms of the pact are quite explicit and clear and binding, and those are important as well. As strange as they are, it's a year and a day from then, correct?
Yes, and it lines up in some striking ways. I don't really have time to get into it here today, but it lines up very interestingly with the number of stanzas that we encounter. Not 100, but 101. And we saw similar sorts of dynamics being played with in previous texts that we've looked at here. But yeah.
Such as Dante,
yes.
Commedia, right? Yep.
Correct. And we see the same sort of structure here. And yes, the terms of the game are extremely clearly laid out. And so watch for those carefully when we get to the far end of the text where we see the second beheading scene, because it is meant as a contrasting scene and contrasting in a myriad of fascinating ways. So yeah.
Okay, shall we progress over that? So to put it briefly, the Green Knight loses his head, picks up his head, and then the speaking head in his hand speaks to Gawain, saying, I'll see you in a year and a day, and rides out of the court.
Yes, and notice also that Gawain stepped in again because he's the arch diplomat. He saves the honor of King Arthur specifically and the Knights of the Round Table in general, because nobody volunteers to play the game. And it gets more and more awkward, and eventually in frustration, the emotional and psychological play in this scene is really quite fascinating. Arthur, in frustration, jumps up and says, fine, I'll do it. That is a big no-no.
Right. He's not doing it out of honor or valor. He's doing it out of the opposite, some sort of.
And so when Gawain says, no, don't worry, I'm your nephew. I'll sort it out. I'll play the game. You shouldn't have. You're the king. You shouldn't have to play the game. You send people to do stuff. But notice that's also set up a very interesting dynamic. Now Gawain does what he does not to attain honor, but to hold back humiliation. So there's a negative impulse driving this quest right at the front end. There's something poisonous in the seed of this quest, and this is part of it. So as you say, then the Green Knight does the unthinkable, grabs his head, off he goes, says, see you in a bit. And you can imagine everyone in the feasting hall is thinking, and I think I'm quoting here, oh crap, oh crap.
That's almost a direct quote.
Yes. So there's that. Okay.
And then they carry on the feasting, and Gawain tarries till Midsummer's Day, I believe it was, something like that.
Yes. He gets to the middle of things, and then he decides, okay, it's time to go out and honor my agreement, because do
you make anything of the fact that it's Midsummer's Day? I mean, in terms of from the darkest time of the year to the brightest time of the year. I mean,
I think, yeah, it's the seasons here are richly symbolic, as they are in many different texts, but even more symbolic perhaps in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He's at as the year is at its height and best, so also Gawain is at his height and his best. And then we move in from there, from that time of year, and Gawain and his reputation over to that very rich arming scene.
Yeah, and then there's the harvest, and he tarries all the way to Michaelmas, and then All Hail Day, All Saints Day. So now we're November 1st, which is interesting. And at that point, then he sets off. So on All Saints Day, that's when he goes, and then the arming scene proceeds, I believe. And in that scene, then what we're going to attend to his shield in particular. You wanted to say something about this. I believe it's line, so it's the second fit, and it's line 620.
Yeah, just before we come to that,
okay,
let me also just very quickly say something general here, which is that remember that the author here is most likely a rural nobleman. This is a nobleman who lives particularly close to what we would nowadays describe as nature or the earth and what have you. So the medieval mind, already generally speaking, is much more in tune with the year, with the seasons, with the land, with all these sorts of things than us relatively numb urbanites.
Yeah, the harvest is explicitly mentioned, so yes.
You think your sense of chronology, because we've been talking about dating and time and stuff like that, but on a year-to-year basis, your chronology for the medieval imagination is largely bound up with things like planting and plowing and cultivating and harvesting and the seasonal changes that come with that, the rains of spring, the beautiful weather of summer, the coming of fall and the harvest and all that goes on with that. These are natural touchstones with which to organize your thinking about your own personal narrative and the narrative of your community and other narratives that you encounter along the way. So again, I try to usually signal that to my students so they have that a little bit more at the forefront of their mind, because it adds another layer to what's happening in here. Yeah, let's talk about the arming scene.
And the pentangle.
Yes, did you want to actually read that section yourself, or?
I have it in medieval English, and I would think it's not the best idea.
Okay.
Yeah, I have the Tolkien translation, but I've misplaced it, and I only have the an edition by Burrow, which is in the actual original Middle English.
Yeah, I've got I think I mentioned this last time, I have the James Winnie page translation. What's the line number again? I don't have it signaled in here.
Well, I have 620 when the pentangle, the paint of pure gold hues, is mentioned.
Okay, so let us move ahead here. We've got a bit, again, first of all, we'll have to talk a little bit about why the author dwells so long on this scene. A lot of my students get bored and confused when they're running through all the details of the arming scene.
But but historically, the arming scenes are what heroes do. Yeah. And the depiction of the hero shield is a fixed type of every heroic scene as well. Not just the arming scene, but what is on the hero's shield is of huge significance, from Achilles to Aeneas and onwards. But you go.
Okay, so I'm going to start here. Again,
it's called an ekphrasis, by the way, the description of what's on it. That's the literary name. It's an ekphrasis. It's an extended narrative of description. In Achilles' shield, it was on the inside. And there was basically the known world was there. Likewise, on Aeneas' shield, there it wasn't a description of the world. It was an account of Roman history on the shield.
And on the gates of the temple as well.
Yeah,
we encounter it again. It occurs on a regular basis. So in that sense, I'm not saying here the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is an epic. It is not an epic.
No.
It is romance. But having said that, this is clearly. Again, a very sophisticated author who has a lot of knowledge about traditions back to which he's speaking and upon which he is drawing in his present day. So let us, I'll just quickly run over the stanza.
Sure.
So here. Then they brought out the shield of shining gules with the pentangle painted on it in pure gold. He swings it over his shoulder, throws it around his neck, where it suited the knight extremely well, and why the pentangle should befit that noble prince, I intend to explain, even should that delay me. It is a symbol that Solomon designed long ago as an emblem of fidelity, and justly so. An emblem of fidelity. I just underscore that line there.
Yeah, betokening of troth. But
Yeah.
yes.
I want you to come back and talk about that in just
All right.
Scott. For it is a figure consisting of 5 points, where each line overlaps and locks into another, and the whole design is continuous, and in England is called everywhere, I am told, the endless knot. Therefore it suits this knight and his shining arms, for always faithful in 5 ways and 5 times in each case. Gawain was reputed as virtuous, like refined gold, devoid of all vice, and with all courtly virtues adorned. So this new painted sign he bore on shield and coat, as man most true of speech and fairest spoken knight. Okay,
Yes.
go on there.
And then it goes on to talk about an extended application of the 5 points on the shield to Gawain's 5 signal characteristics. But you wanted me to say something about line 626, I believe it's betokening of troth. The word troth here is really important for the whole of the thematic structure of the narrative, insofar as Gawain is going to have given his word, plighted his troth to the Green Knight before he left. That was part of the beheading game, was that he had to, before he took, that is, the Green Knight took the axe stroke that lost him his head, Gawain had to give his word that he would find him out in a year and a day, and he would receive the same in kind. And that word is what bound Gawain to him. It's part of the game, but it's also a part of Gawain's honor as a Christian knight. And so his word is his bond. It's not just something that he agreed to. It's a representation of his entire being. He must be that. And it's not just being true to his word. It's a covenant that's been made. So it's a bond like one makes to one's liege lord. Right? There's a swearing of oaths, and often it's symbols are given, tokens like a ring or something like that. There's a relationship that's been established. So here, the sign that Solomon has set on his shield, the endless knot of the 5 points of the pentangle, are in betokening of troth by title. So that symbol is a symbol of Gawain himself, and with Gawain of the ideal Christian knight. Did you want to say more about that? Or
just a little bit, actually. Again, it's another way of kind of defamiliarizing our modern expectations when it comes to things like pledges and troth and what have you. We tend to think of promises very much in contractual terms nowadays. It's a contract, and as such, it draws on a model of sort of business contracts and stuff like that. But we have to remember that this would strike your average medieval as both crude and strange. This is an odd way to talk about promises between human beings.
Irreligious, really, quite frankly. Yeah.
Yeah. We have to recall that certain things like pledging of troth, like pledging of...
Which is what you do when you marry somebody, right? You plight your troth.
Yes, exactly. That is where I'm going with this. Because, of course, in the late 60s in Canada, we changed the covenantal understanding of marriage into a contractual understanding of marriage. And a lot of people just glossed over that and moved on, thinking about social history and things like that. But that was actually a very significant and, I would argue, unfortunate moment in Canadian history.
I could not agree more. And I think it's the word that is given is a word not only to your partner, but before God, and it is binding, and there are blessings incumbent upon it, and also curses should it be broken.
That's right. It's witnessed first and foremost by God. That's why we have the traditional language of the marriage vows and what have you, explicitly oftentimes calls that to people's attention. And as you say, I mean, again, we have an extension of certain pagan notions here. Remember, we were talking about pietas in a pagan Roman sort of context with Aeneas.
Yes, with Aeneas, yes.
This is constituted by his sacred obligations to his duties, however understood. Here we have a Christianizing of that, and I would, again, argue a great enriching of that notion. These are not just promises. A promise, if it's a troth like this, is a sacred agreement. It's not an agreement, it's a sacred agreement. And if you violate it, you violate not just normalized senses of right and wrong and norms and things like that. You violate, again, that taboo boundary. You have just crossed over to something and violated something sacred. You've done a bad thing in a very, very different spiritual, deep sense.
Yeah, and not just towards God, you've done it to yourself. You've cut off the very lifeblood from which your own life flows, connected with virtue and a sense of sanctity about all of life. That is what is severed.
Yeah, and we have to remember here that, I mean, there's some Stoic and Epicurean machinery also contributing way back in the background here, and that there's this notion, persistent Roman notion that gets taken up by certain Christian thinkers, that being virtuous is its own reward, but by extension, being evil is its own punishment.
Yes.
It becomes part of your identity. And that's the burden you carry on your back when you're burdened by sins and things like this. So Gawain is going to flirt with this dangerous realm of covenants and violating covenants, as we shall see.
So he's faultless in his 5 wits. He has the 5 elements of the cross. There are the 5 joys of Mary. There's a whole, and by the way, on the inside of the shield, we didn't get to this, Mary herself is depicted.
Yes.
And when he's in trouble, he looks to her.
Yes, he does. So she actually functions as an icon in terms of medieval iconography. So it's a meditative and contemplative tool. And it's right there when things are darkest, and he has to shelter behind it. And also, of course, he's sheltering behind the Virgin Mary, also symbolically in certain ways. Some of our listeners may know that the cult of Mary was very much on the rise and was perhaps at its height during the Central and later Middle Ages. This is something that started in France, but it traveled very quickly to other parts of Europe, including England. And the cult of Mary is clearly, not just in this text, but the other texts of Pearl and Clanness and what have you, Marian theology is underscored at numerous points. It seems that the author was very, very oriented in this direction. So here we have another iteration of that, the respect and fascination he has for the cult of Mary. Yeah, and we've got all these different 5s coming up. We've got, I think we mentioned this last time, the 5 virtues of Gawain, which are friendship, generosity, chastity. Chastity, by the way, in the broader conceptual sense, there are things he holds himself back from, not just sexual, though that will crop up as it turns out.
He's got 5 wits. He's got 5 fingers. He's got the 5 wounds of Christ. He's got the 5 joys of marriage, and the 5th 5 are those 5 that you just mentioned. Yeah.
And we could geek out about this all day long. I mean, we got the 5 wits, I believe probably alludes to the 5 inner senses. We got the 5 outer senses and the 5 inner senses according to the medieval imagination. And this is the kind of stuff that takes up a lot of scholarship.
But Gawain is the ideal male figure here then.
Yeah, there's a raging argument amongst both its original audience and successive generations as to who was the greatest of the Knights of the Round Table. And Lancelot, of course, sometimes gets signaled, but of course Lancelot is an adulterer and a betrayer.
It's a bit of a problem.
Seems a little vexed. But the fact that he can stomp anybody who says that, hey, you're doing a bad thing, insulates him against being accused of doing bad things. So Gawain, though, is a very sort of attractive candidate for this status. He doesn't... in the end, of course, he is not that person who is signaled out as the perfect knight. But that's
Percival, right? But yeah,
exactly, yeah. But again, you and I don't have time, nor is this the proper venue for discussing all those intricate details, interesting though they are.
So he arms himself and he gets on his horse, literally, and he goes up north, and he goes up north through the west of England on the coast of Wales towards the Wirral, in other words, the Liverpool area, so the northwest of England. Mm-hmm. And he then encounters, well, first of all, he's freezing cold and he doesn't know if he's going to get there, and he prays, and at that point he prays to the Virgin. Mm-hmm. It's revealed to him, right? The castle.
Correct. Yeah. So again, the author's just doing, I think, some really practical stuff here. He sets up the sheer misery of Gawain out there shivering in his armor. It sucks. It's terrible. And then all of a sudden, as you say, he prays and it is revealed. And we have an immediate contrast to this wonderful host scene, and there's warm fire, and there's food, and there's hospitality. There's all these things, and they're directly contrasting by way of binary opposition to where we just found Sir Gawain out there. I do want to mention just a glancing thing here and pass, almost a strange little aside. At one point, Gawain gets into trouble with all sorts of nasties out there, as one does, I suppose, when you're on a quest. But there's only one that he actually, that the author really sort of zeroes on for a second, and then he's gone again. But it's a creature which has caught the imagination of many, many later writers, and that is the feature of, that is the Wodwo, Wodwo, or some people pronounce it Vodwo. What is a Vodwo? Nobody knows, but it's mean, and it lives in forests, and it attacks knights, apparently.
Excellent.
And it has been associated with the name of Woden, as in the god. Woden.
Woden. Oh, okay.
Yeah. And Woden's name comes from the madness, the exaltation that comes with the slaughter of the battlefield. What is the connection beyond that, if any? Maybe it's just coincidental. We don't know. But again, it's one of these striking connections. You find them everywhere in this text. Anyway, let's get back to...
we're going to run out of time to do this episode. Let's get through the second fit, and then we'll take a break, and we'll move to the fits 3 and 4 next time. Sure. But he gets to the Green Chapel, and then he encounters the Lord of the Manor there, who receives him with great courtesy. But he's accompanied by 2 other strange figures, and I just wanted to mention them, at least because it's not insignificant either. One of them is a beautiful woman likened unto Guinevere, or Wenora, as she's called in the medieval English here, 945. The other is a little bit different looking, shall we say. Did you want to read that? I have the medieval, and I think that it is going to be embarrassing. Should I read it?
It's a big, long stanza, but let's have a go at it anyway. When dinner was finished and Gawain had risen, the time had drawn on almost to night. Chaplains made their way to the castle chapels, rang their bells loudly, just as they should for devout evensong on that holy occasion. The Lord makes his way there, and his lady too, who gracefully enters a finely carved pew. Gawain hastens there, smartly dressed, and quickly arrives. The Lord takes him by the sleeve and leads him to a seat and greets him familiarly, calling him by his name, and said that he was the welcomest guest in the world. Gawain thanked him heartily, and the 2 men embraced and sat gravely together while the service lasted. Then the lady wished to set eyes on the knight, and left her pew with many fair women. And here we go. She was the loveliest on earth in complexion and features, in figure, in coloring and behavior above all others, and more beautiful than Guinevere, it seemed to that knight. She came through the chapel to greet him courteously. Another lady, leading her by the left hand, we'll come back and we'll talk about that in a second, who was older than she, an aged one it seemed, and respectfully treated by the assembled knights, but very different in looks were those 2 ladies. For where the young one was fresh and the other was withered, every part of that one was rosily aglow. On the other, rough wrinkled cheeks hung in folds. Many bright pearls adorned the kerchief of one, whose breast and white throat, uncovered and bare, shone more dazzling than the snow new fallen on hills. The other wore a gorget over her neck, her swarthy chin wrapped in chalk-white veils, her forehead enfolded in silk, muffled up everywhere. With embroidered hems and lattice work of tiny stitching, so that nothing was exposed of her but her black brows, her 2 eyes and her nose, her naked lips, which were repulsive to see and shockingly bleared. A noble lady indeed you might call her, by God, with body squat and thick, and buttocks bulging broad. More delectable in looks was the lady whom she led.
So there's certainly an element of humor in the portrait here. I think we have to. I mean, we mentioned it in the first episode that Gawain, for all of the mystery and the grandeur of the portrait, is also not verse to humorous portraits, and this one is certainly very funny. Beauty
Yes.
and the Beast, as it were.
Yeah, and this is actually, again, another one of these regular motifs, a leitmotif, if you like, of many different medieval tales, not just romances, where you have a careful up-close study of a repulsive woman. And I can't remember if I mentioned this other very strange, oftentimes very funny tale, Dame Ragnall and Sir Gawain, the tale of Dame Ragnall and Sir Gawain, where,
No, you didn't mention that.
okay, just very, very quickly, because some of the original readers might have had this tale in mind when we're getting this description of this loathly lady. By the way, that's the proper term for her. She's a loathly lady. And for some reason, in the other story, Gawain rapes a woman, which is very incongruous with his character. And we're not told much about it. It's something that precedes the tale. And he is put on trial, as he should be. And he is given over to the judgment of the queen and her court, Guinevere. By the way, Guinevere and Gawain have a very relationship. And she says, if you can find out in 1 year's time, then in 1 year and a day, come back to me and tell me this. What is the one thing all women want? And of course, everyone is sort of meant to be dismayed by this, and we never know what they want.
Gawain? I have no idea.
The quest, and Gawain's asking everybody, and nobody can give him the answer, or they all give him different answers and what have you. And eventually, he's heading back to the court to pay the penalty, to die for his sins. When he meets a loathly lady, not unlike the one we just encountered here. And she says, I'll tell you what all women want, but in return, you have to marry me. And they spend a lot of time really doing what is being done here in this text, where they go over every minute little detail and explore just how repulsive this woman is, which is, of course, a countertype to another medieval way of doing literary business, where you describe a beautiful woman from the head down, bit, all the different things of her, and they dwell on these things. She whispers something in his ear. He goes off. He tells Queen Guinevere and her court the answer. What do women want? Sovereignty. There's your answer.
Oh.
And Guinevere looks at her ladies and says, by thunder, he got it. Okay, I guess you get to live. And Gawain says, okay, by the way, I'm getting hitched. So along comes the wedding, and everyone's dismayed. Gawain, the most sought after of knights by the women of the court, is marrying one of the most repulsive creatures in all of England. And then they get to the bedchamber to consummate things and what have you. And she asks him another question. I can either be absolutely gorgeous during the day when you're out in public with everybody, but a hideous hag at night when you and I are in the bedchamber. Or I could be absolutely gorgeous here in the bedchamber, but I will be a hideous woman out in public, continuously draped on your arm. Which one is it? Again, it's a second trap. And Gawain quite wisely recognizes it as a trap and says, I don't know, you decide, you're sovereign. And she says, dancer, I'm beautiful both day and night. And that is the marriage of Gawain and Dame Ragnall.
Wow. So that it's a little bit like, gosh, with the Shrek and the all that. Oh.
Yes. Oh no.
I didn't know that.
Yes, it's not an uncommon medieval tale. So again, more backdrop potentially to what we're seeing here. But Scott, tell us a little bit about some of the details of this scene.
Well, I mean, I don't have that much. I mean, the appearance is obviously standards of beauty, and the portraits thereof. The women, the attractive woman is white skinned because she's not worked a day in her life and all that. And the clothing she wears and so forth. I mean, the thing that I draw attention to is the fact she is led by the left hand by the elder of the two women, an ancient one, and the left hand has the connotations of the sinister in Latin. So the mana sinistra here, the left hand, and so she's a diabolical figure.
Yes. And there's a few other indications that she is also a bad person. Remember, to the medieval imagination, again, very, very, everything's symbolic, everything's figurative. And so one's appearance speaks oftentimes volumes about the character of the person. Nowadays, of course, we spend a lot of time preaching against that kind of thing, how outward appearances and abilities and things like that have,
and so forth. Yeah.
And we pound the table so long and so hard on that one that we kind of lose sight, or we're shocked when medievals start implying something about the character by the physical appearance of certain characters. But remember, they're able to think figuratively. The people are oftentimes making the mistake here of misinterpreting the external appearance with the inner character.
Are we body shaming that old lady? Is that what's going on?
Exactly. We're body shaming that old crone. Notice she has black brows.
Yes, yes.
Black hair in the Middle Ages, both the early and high Middle Ages, was considered ugly, to use their word for it, hideous. If you have a black-haired individual, you might want to think of medieval characters like that as the sort of medieval analog to the old Western, where the guy who was wearing the black hat is your bad guy. That's how you spot him. So she's got black brows. Remember, blonde is your ideal. Gray eyes is your ideal. Fair-skinned, as you say, is your ideal. Long necks. If you look at medieval portraiture of quote-unquote beautiful women, you'll notice they also have high foreheads, ridiculously high foreheads, because that was thought to be beautiful. They would actually pluck their hair along the top here, oftentimes to raise the level of their forehead. And long necks, you'll see it also in portraiture, these women with these long, almost giraffe-like white necks. Yeah, I know. Anyway, so a striking contrast again, because we said this in the previous podcast, so much in here is meant to be read comparatively. And likewise, you immediately get two characters side by side, quite literally, and one is leading the other with all the rich symbolism behind that, because, of course, this is going to be none other than our arch villain of the tale. But we'll come to her presently and anon. Scott, was there more you wanted to say on this scene here?
Well, just the conclusion of this is the game that he, the Lord of the Manor proposes with him, I believe.
Yes.
That he should, Gawain should remain with them, tarry for a few days, and Lord of the Manor will go out hunting and return at the end of the day's hunting with whatever he's caught, and Gawain will receive from him that as a gift, and in return just must simply reciprocate whatever he's received, will give in turn to the Lord of the Manor, and that's it.
Yes.
And he agrees to it. Gawain, after this long voyage battling through monsters, he finds himself exhausted, and of course he agrees to the game.
Yeah, it's the second game of the story, sometimes known as the hunting game.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not, again, it's not incredibly anomalous. It's somewhat traditional in mythology, literature, and folklore. So this is not the first time this happens either. We're going to talk about that in very considerable detail with our next podcast, to be sure. Yeah. So I'm not going to go into that too much at this point. Is there any final thing, though, that we want to sum up with here before we leave this chunk of the tale behind us?
No, I think so. It concludes with these lines: "To bed yet ere they yeed, recorded covenants oft the old lord of that lead, couth well hold lake aloft." Anyway, something. So there's a covenant that's been once again established between the two, in the same way that he had established a covenant with the Green Knight. Now he's established a covenant with the Lord of the Manor.
Yes, and he breaks both covenants significantly with all these sort of thematic and moral implications that brings with him. Let me leave off with also noting, just for the listener's benefit here, Tolkien pointed out quite rightly when he was analyzing this text that the character of Bersilac, or Bertilac, depending on which translation.
The Lord of the Manor. Or no, the Green Knight. No, it's both. Yes, sorry. Yeah, oops.
Plot spoiler. That he's often portrayed at this point in the text and somewhat later as a loud, boisterous, jovial character. There's every now and again there's a bit of the buffoon about him, and he's very much about jokes and laughter and conviviality, and he's a great host. He's wonderfully entertaining to be around. It sounds very much like, left to his own devices, Bersilac is the life of the party. Great guy to have as your friend. He's continuously patting you on the shoulder and saying interesting things, and quick to laugh. And there's going to be a magnificent character turn as we get to the end, as we realize that Bersalak is a much more serious figure than we had first thought. He's not quite as buffoonish as we thought. In fact, he's not, there's nothing foolish about him at all. There's a terrible wisdom about this guy. And the laughter dies away and the smile dies away. And he's just left looking down at Gawain in particular and human society and the Knights of the Round Table more generally speaking. So watch for that rise in that character, that very, very interesting rise as Gawain has a similar fall towards the end. So
okay, well, that you've left us off with something to look forward to. That's great. Shall we conclude with that, Bill?
we will. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for tuning in and listening. I am, as always, Dr. Bill Friesen, and I am joined here by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson. Thank you, and this has been Paideia Today.